In a small, quiet town surrounded by endless fields of golden corn and lush soybeans, there lived a boy named Marcus Johnson. He was 15 years old and the son of Elijah Johnson, a hard-working farmer who had spent his entire life tending to their modest family farm. The farm wasn't large or fancy, but it was enough to keep food on the table and provide for Marcus's schooling. Despite their simple lifestyle, Marcus carried himself with dignity. He walked 5 miles every day to attend Westwood High School, a place where most students came from families much wealthier than his. Marcus was different from many of his classmates. While some kids drove to school in shiny cars or wore expensive clothes, Marcus always arrived in the same pair of sturdy boots and a faded jacket that had been patched up more times than he could count. His backpack was old, its straps frayed, and his textbooks were secondhand, filled with notes scribbled by previous owners. But none of this bothered Marcus. What mattered to him was the knowledge inside those books, not how they looked on the outside. At school, Marcus kept mostly to himself. He wasn't loud or flashy. Instead, he preferred to sit quietly in class, listening intently to every word the teacher said. His teachers often noticed how sharp his mind was. During lessons, while other students doodled in their notebooks or stared out the window, Marcus would raise his hand to ask thoughtful questions or offer insightful answers. Some of his teachers admired his dedication, but others found him intimidating because he seemed to know things even they hadn't thought about before. Outside of academics, Marcus didn't have many friends at school. Many of the students whispered behind his back, making fun of his worn-out clothes and the fact that he always smelled faintly of earth and hay from working on the farm after school. They teased him for being country and called him names like Farmer Boy, but Marcus never let their words get to him. Instead, he channeled all his energy into studying harder and dreaming bigger. Deep down, he knew that education was his ticket to a better future, a future where no one could judge him based on what he wore or where he came from. Life at home wasn't easy either. Every morning, Marcus woke up before sunrise to help his father with chores around the farm. There were cows to milk, crops to water, and fences to mend. After finishing his work, he'd grab a quick breakfast, usually bread and butter, and set off on his long walk to school. By the time he returned in the evening, the sun was setting, and there was still more work waiting for him. It was a tough routine, but Marcus never complained. He understood that his family depended on him, just as much as he depended on them. What made Marcus unique wasn't just his determination, it was also his curiosity. Even though he didn't have access to the latest technology or resources, he loved learning about the world beyond his small town. On weekends, when he wasn't helping on the farm, he'd visit the local library and borrow books about history, science, and geography. He dreamed of traveling someday, seeing places he'd only read about in those pages. For now, though, he was content to soak up as much knowledge as possible, knowing it would prepare him for whatever challenges lay ahead. Little did Marcus know, his quiet life was about to change forever. One ordinary afternoon, something unexpected would happen that would test his strength, resilience, and courage in ways he couldn't imagine. It was a typical afternoon at Westwood High School, and Marcus sat quietly in his history class, listening as Mr. Grayson lectured about the American Revolution. The room buzzed faintly with the sound of pencils scratching against paper and the occasional shuffle of feet under desks. Most students were only half paying attention, doodling in their notebooks or sneaking glances at their phones when they thought the teacher wasn't looking. But Marcus was different. He leaned forward slightly in his seat, his eyes fixed on the textbook open before him, absorbing every word. As Mr. Grayson spoke, Marcus noticed something odd. The teacher mentioned that George Washington had led troops across the Delaware River on Christmas night in 1776, but according to the textbook, the crossing actually took place late on December 25th and into the early hours of December 26th. It was a small detail, but it mattered to Marcus. He raised his hand hesitantly, unsure if he should interrupt. When Mr. Grayson finally called on him, Marcus cleared his throat and said politely, "Sir, I think there's a mistake. The book says Washington crossed the river during the night, not exactly on Christmas." The classroom fell silent. Some students turned to look at Marcus, surprised that he dared to correct the teacher. Mr. Grayson paused mid-sentence, his face reddening slightly. For a moment, he seemed caught off guard, but then his expression hardened. Instead of acknowledging the correction, he snapped, "Are you saying I'm wrong, Marcus? Do you think you know more than me?" Marcus blinked, startled by the sharp tone. "No, sir," he replied quickly. "I just wanted to point out what the book says. That's all." But Mr. Grayson wasn't satisfied. His voice grew louder as he continued. "This isn't your lecture, young man. You're here to listen, not challenge authority. If you want to show off, do it somewhere else." Several students snickered, and Marcus felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment. He hadn't meant to cause trouble. He was simply trying to clarify a fact. Yet now, it felt like everyone was laughing at him. Things escalated quickly. When Marcus tried to explain himself again, Mr. Grayson cut him off, accusing him of being disrespectful and disruptive. "That's it," the teacher barked, slamming his palm on the desk. "You've pushed too far this time. Go to the principal's office right now and consider yourself expelled." The room went completely still. Marcus stared at Mr. Grayson, stunned. Expelled? For asking a question. He opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. What could he say? His heart sank as he gathered his things and stood up, feeling the weight of everyone's eyes on him. As he walked toward the door, he heard whispers from his classmates, some mocking, others sympathetic. But he kept his head down, refusing to let them see how hurt he felt. Once outside the classroom, Marcus leaned against the wall, clutching his backpack tightly. He replayed the scene over and over in his mind, wondering what he could have done differently. Had he really deserved to be punished so harshly? It didn't seem fair, but fairness wasn't something Marcus expected much of from life. Growing up on a farm and walking miles to school had taught him that the world often favored those with money and power, leaving people like him to fend for themselves. Still, this felt different. This wasn't just about being poor or working hard. It was about standing up for the truth, even if it came at a cost. As Marcus trudged down the hallway toward the principal's office, he couldn't shake the feeling that this incident would change everything. Little did he know, it already had. By the time Marcus reached home that evening, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the fields. The air smelled of fresh hay and damp earth, a comforting reminder of the life he knew. But tonight, the quiet farm felt heavier than usual. Elijah, Marcus's father, was waiting for him on the porch, his face lined with worry. When Marcus stepped out of the dirt path leading from the main road, Elijah didn't say a word at first. He simply watched his son approach, noticing the way Marcus dragged his feet and avoided meeting his gaze. "Something happened," Elijah said finally, his deep voice cutting through the silence. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. Marcus hesitated, unsure where to begin. How could he explain to his father that he'd been expelled for something as small as pointing out a mistake in class? He took a deep breath and told him everything. The lecture, the correction, Mr. Grayson's anger, and the harsh punishment that followed. Elijah listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening with each word. By the time Marcus finished, the older man was on his feet, pacing back and forth across the creaky wooden boards of the porch. "This can't stand," Elijah muttered under his breath. "They can't treat you like this. Not for speaking the truth." The next morning, Elijah put on his best shirt, a faded blue one he saved for church, and drove into town to speak with the school administration. The principal, Mr. Lewis, greeted him politely but seemed distracted, glancing at his watch more than once during their conversation. When Elijah explained what had happened, Mr. Lewis sighed and shook his head. "I understand your frustration, Mr. Johnson," he said, leaning back in his chair, "but these things happen. Teachers have the right to maintain order in their classrooms." Elijah frowned. "Order? My son wasn't causing trouble. He was asking the question. Are you telling me he deserves to be kicked out for that? Mr. Lewis shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Look, we're not saying Marcus is a bad student, but rules are rules. If we let every child argue with their teachers, where will it end? Elijah opened his mouth to respond, but then stopped himself. He looked around the office, taking in the polished furniture and framed diplomas on the walls. In that moment, he realized something painful. They weren't going to listen to him. To them, he was just a farmer, a nobody with dirt under his nails and no connections to powerful people. His shoulders slumped slightly, but only for a moment. Then, determination flared in his eyes. That night, after dinner, Elijah sat down at the kitchen table with an old phone book. He flipped through the pages until he found the number he needed. It had been years since he'd spoken to his father, Henry Hank Thompson. Their relationship had always been strained, filled with arguments about money, pride, and the choices Elijah had made in life. But now, Elijah didn't care about any of that. All that mattered was clearing his son's name. With a deep breath, Elijah dialed the number. After several rings, a gruff voice answered. "Hello. It's me, Dad," Elijah said, his tone firm but respectful. "I need your help." There was a long pause on the other end. Finally, Hank replied, "What kind of help?" Elijah explained the situation, leaving out no details. As he spoke, he could almost picture his father sitting in his luxurious city apartment, listening intently. When he finished, there was another pause, followed by a low chuckle. "Don't worry, son," Hank said. "I'll handle it." Relief washed over Elijah, though it was mixed with a pang of guilt. He hadn't wanted to ask for his father's help, but desperate times called for desperate measures. For the first time since the ordeal began, Elijah allowed himself to feel a flicker of hope. Whatever happened next, one thing was certain. Marcus's story wasn't over yet. The next morning, the quiet town of Westwood was abuzz with an unusual sight. A sleek black Rolls-Royce glided smoothly down the main road, its polished surface gleaming under the pale sunlight. The car moved with such grace and authority that people stopped what they were doing to stare. Farmers paused mid-chore, shopkeepers leaned out of their doors, and students walking to school craned their necks to catch a glimpse. No one in this small rural community had ever seen anything like it. When the Rolls-Royce pulled up outside Westwood High School, whispers erupted among the crowd of teenagers gathered near the entrance. "Who is that?" One student murmured, nudging her friend. Another boy shrugged, his eyes wide with awe. The driver stepped out first, dressed in a crisp uniform, and opened the rear door. Out emerged a tall, distinguished man with silver hair and a perfectly tailored suit. He carried himself with an air of confidence that commanded attention. This was Henry Hank Thompson, Marcus's grandfather, a man who seemed to belong more to the world of boardrooms and penthouses than dusty country roads. Hank didn't waste any time. With long, purposeful strides, he walked straight into the school building, bypassing the startled secretary at the front desk. His presence alone silenced any protests she might have made. Students parted like water as he passed them in the hallway, their curious gazes following him until he disappeared into the principal's office. Inside, Principal Lewis looked up from his desk, clearly unprepared for the imposing figure standing before him. "Mr. Thompson," Hank said firmly, not waiting to be invited to sit. "We need to talk about my grandson, Marcus Johnson." Principal Lewis blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. He hadn't expected anyone like Hank, someone who radiated power and influence, to walk into his office over a disciplinary matter. "Of course, Mr. Thompson," he stammered, gesturing toward a chair. But Hank remained standing, his piercing gaze fixed on the principal. "I've been informed that Marcus was expelled for correcting a factual error in class," Hank began, his voice calm but laced with steel. "Care to explain how such a trivial incident could justify ruining a child's academic record?" Principal Lewis shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Well, it wasn't just the correction itself," he tried to explain. "It's about respecting authority and maintaining discipline in the classroom." Hank raised an eyebrow. Respect works both ways. He countered sharply. Are you telling me your teachers don't respect their students enough to acknowledge when they're right? Or does authority mean silencing anyone who dares to think for themselves? The principal opened his mouth to respond, but Hank cut him off. From his briefcase, he pulled out a neatly typed letter signed by a prominent civil rights attorney. Placing it on the desk, he said, "This outlines our intent to pursue legal action if Marcus isn't reinstated immediately and publicly apologized to. I'm sure you understand the implications." Principal Lewis paled as he skimmed the document. The last thing he needed was a lawsuit drawing negative attention to the school. After a tense moment, he nodded reluctantly. "We'll fix this," he promised. "Marcus will be welcomed back, and we'll issue a formal apology." Satisfied, Hank gave a curt nod. "Good. Because if I hear even a whisper of unfair treatment toward my grandson again, I won't hesitate to escalate further." With that, he turned and left the room, leaving Principal Lewis sweating in his chair. As Hank exited the school, the Rolls-Royce still waiting patiently outside, students whispered excitedly among themselves. They had no idea who this man was, but one thing was clear. Marcus Johnson was not someone to underestimate anymore. And as Hank climbed back into the luxurious car, he couldn't help but smile faintly. Justice might be slow sometimes, but when wielded properly, it always arrived, with style. The day after Hank's dramatic visit, Westwood High School buzzed with excitement and tension. News of the mysterious man in the Rolls-Royce had spread like wildfire, and everyone seemed to have a theory about who he was and why he'd shown up. Some students speculated that Marcus had secretly been adopted by a millionaire, while others joked that maybe he was royalty in disguise. But one thing was undeniable. Marcus Johnson was no longer just the farmer's son. He had become someone people wanted to know, or at least avoid crossing. When Marcus arrived at school the next morning, he could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on him. Normally, he kept his head down and avoided drawing attention. But today was different. For once, he didn't slouch or shuffle his feet as he walked through the hallways. Instead, he held his chin high, feeling a strange mix of pride and unease. The principal himself had made an announcement over the intercom during homeroom, apologizing for the misunderstanding and welcoming Marcus back to class. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make Marcus realize that things were changing, whether he liked it or not. His first class of the day was history, the same one where everything had gone wrong. As Marcus entered the room, Mr. Grayson looked up from his desk, his expression unreadable. For a moment, their eyes met, and Marcus felt a flicker of satisfaction when he saw the uneasiness in the teacher's gaze. Mr. Grayson quickly looked away, pretending to shuffle papers. When the lesson began, his tone was noticeably softer, almost cautious, as if afraid of sparking another confrontation. Marcus didn't say a word during the entire period, but he couldn't help noticing how some of his classmates glanced nervously between him and the teacher, wondering if sparks would fly again. Outside of class, life at school took on a new rhythm. A few students who had mocked Marcus before now went out of their way to be friendly, offering smiles or even inviting him to sit with them at lunch. Others kept their distance, whispering behind his back about how he must have connections now. At first, Marcus found it hard to trust these sudden shifts in behavior. Were they being genuine, or were they just scared of what might happen if they crossed him? Either way, he decided not to dwell on it too much. What mattered most was focusing on his studies and proving that he belonged here, not because of his grandfather's wealth, but because of his own hard work. Meanwhile, Hank stayed in town longer than anyone expected. After dealing with the school administration, he surprised Elijah and Marcus by announcing that he wanted to spend more time getting to know his family. Over the next few days, he visited the farm, walking through the fields and listening intently as Elijah explained the challenges of farming in such tough economic times. To everyone's astonishment, Hank rolled up his sleeves and helped with chores, though his expensive shoes weren't exactly suited for muddy terrain. Despite his polished exterior, there was still a hint of the old Hank beneath the surface, a man who hadn't forgotten his roots, even if he'd left them behind years ago. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Hank sat with Marcus on the porch, sharing stories about his own struggles growing up. "People judged me based on my skin color and where I came from," he said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "They thought I'd never amount to anything, but I refused to let them define me. You're cut from the same cloth, Marcus. Don't ever forget that." Marcus nodded, absorbing every word. For the first time, he felt a deep connection to this grandfather he barely knew, a man who understood what it meant to fight against prejudice and come out stronger on the other side. And as they sat together under the starlit sky, Marcus realized something important. The Rolls-Royce wasn't just a symbol of wealth. It represented resilience, courage, and the power to stand up for what was right, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. In the weeks that followed Hank's intervention, Marcus began to notice subtle but meaningful changes, not just in how others treated him, but also in how he saw himself. The once quiet boy who preferred to stay in the shadows now carried himself with a quiet confidence that caught the attention of both teachers and classmates. It wasn't arrogance, it was assurance, the kind that comes from knowing you've been validated, not because of wealth or connections, but because someone believed enough in your worth to fight for you. At school, Marcus threw himself into his studies with renewed energy. He joined the debate team, a decision that initially surprised even himself. Public speaking had always made him nervous, but Hank encouraged him to step out of his comfort zone. "You've got a sharp mind, Marcus," Hank told him one evening over dinner at the farm. "Use it. Show them what you're capable of." With his grandfather's words echoing in his mind, Marcus signed up for the next competition. Though he stumbled through his first few speeches, he quickly improved, learning to articulate his thoughts clearly and passionately. By the end of the semester, he'd earned second place in a regional tournament, a feat no one could have predicted months earlier. His newfound confidence didn't go unnoticed. Some students who had once teased him now approached him with genuine curiosity, asking about his opinions on current events or how he managed to balance farming and academics. Even Mr. Grayson seemed different around him. Gone was the sharp edge in his voice when addressing Marcus. Instead, he often nodded approvingly during class discussions, acknowledging Marcus's contributions without hesitation. It wasn't friendship, exactly, but it was respect. And for Marcus, that felt like a victory. Outside of academics, Marcus spent more time with Hank, soaking up every story and lesson the older man shared. They would sit together in the living room late at night, talking about everything from business strategies to life lessons. One evening, Hank pulled out an old photo album filled with pictures from his early days as a real estate entrepreneur. "I started with nothing," Hank said, pointing to a grainy black and white image of a rundown office building. "But I learned early on that success isn't about luck. It's about persistence. You keep pushing, even when people tell you it's impossible." Inspired by these conversations, Marcus began thinking about his own future. For years, he dreamed of leaving the farm behind to explore the wider world, but now those dreams took shape in ways he hadn't imagined. He started researching universities and scholarships, determined to find a path that would allow him to build a better life while staying true to his roots. Hank promised to help however he could, offering guidance on applications and interviews. But more importantly, he reminded Marcus that his upbringing, as challenging as it was, had given him something money couldn't buy: resilience. Elijah watched all of this unfold with a mixture of pride and relief. Seeing his father and son bond so deeply brought a sense of healing to their fractured family. There were still moments of tension, especially when Hank's city ways clashed with Elijah's simpler lifestyle, but they worked through them, finding common ground in their love for Marcus. On weekends, the three men would work side by side on the farm, laughing and sharing stories as the sun set over the fields. It was a picture of unity none of them had expected, but one they cherished deeply. As the school year drew to a close, Marcus found himself reflecting on how far he'd come. From being ridiculed for his worn-out clothes to standing tall despite adversity, he realized that strength came not from avoiding challenges, but from facing them head-on. And though the Rolls-Royce had turned heads and opened doors, it was the values instilled in him by his father and grandfather that truly mattered. With each passing day, Marcus grew surer of one thing. No matter where life took him, he would carry the lessons of the farm and the legacy of resilience with him wherever he went. The final months of Marcus's high school journey passed in a whirlwind of activity. With his expulsion overturned and his confidence restored, he embraced every opportunity that came his way. His teachers noticed the change immediately. Marcus wasn't just participating in class anymore. He was leading discussions, asking thought-provoking questions, and helping classmates who struggled to understand complex topics. Even Mr. Grayson, whose rigid demeanor had once intimidated Marcus, began treating him with a newfound respect. It was as if the entire school had shifted its perspective, seeing Marcus not as the farmer's son, but as a bright, determined young man destined for greatness. By spring, Marcus had become a household name at Westwood High, not because of his grandfather's wealth or influence, but because of his achievements. He excelled in the debate team, earning accolades at regional competitions. His essays on history and social justice were published in the school magazine, sparking conversations among students and faculty alike. And when the annual science fair rolled around, Marcus presented an innovative project on sustainable farming techniques inspired by his life on the farm. To everyone's surprise, including his own, he won first place, beating out students from wealthier backgrounds who had access to far more resources. As graduation approached, Marcus learned he'd been selected as valedictorian, a decision that thrilled some and irked others. A few students grumbled about favoritism, whispering behind his back that his rise to success had only happened because of Hank's intervention. But most knew better. They saw how hard Marcus worked, often staying late after school to study or help struggling peers. They'd witnessed his humility despite his accomplishments, always crediting his family and community for shaping who he was. By the time commencement day arrived, even the skeptics couldn't deny that Marcus deserved every bit of recognition he received. On the morning of graduation, Elijah woke up before dawn to prepare for the big day. The Johnsons didn't have much money, but they made sure Marcus looked his best. Elijah polished an old pair of dress shoes he'd worn to his own wedding years ago, while Marcus's mother pressed his suit until it gleamed. When Hank arrived later that morning in his Rolls-Royce, dressed impeccably in a tailored navy suit, he couldn't help but smile at the sight of his grandson standing proudly beside the farmhouse. "You look ready to take on the world," Hank said, clapping Marcus on the shoulder. At the ceremony, held outdoors under a canopy of fluttering flags, Marcus delivered a speech that left the audience spellbound. Speaking without notes, he recounted his journey, from walking miles to school each day to overcoming prejudice and adversity. He spoke about resilience, gratitude, and the importance of standing up for what's right, no matter the cost. "We all face obstacles," he said, his voice steady and clear. "But those challenges don't define us. They refine us. They teach us who we are and what we're capable of becoming." As he concluded, the crowd erupted into applause, many wiping away tears. Afterward, during the reception, friends, teachers, and neighbors lined up to congratulate Marcus. Some thanked him for inspiring them. Others simply hugged him, unable to put their feelings into words. Even Principal Lewis shook his hand warmly, calling him a true leader. For Marcus, it was overwhelming, but in the best possible way. That evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table, Hank raised a toast. To Marcus, he said, his eyes glistening with pride, "May you never forget where you came from, and may you always remember that your potential is limitless." Marcus smiled, feeling the deep sense of gratitude. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, surrounded by the people who loved him most, He felt unstoppable. Years later, Marcus stood on the stage of a grand university auditorium, dressed in a cap and gown, ready to deliver the commencement speech for his graduating class. The room was filled with hundreds of students, faculty members, and proud families. But Marcus's mind drifted back to the small farm where it all began. He thought about the long walks to school, the worn-out textbooks, and the countless hours spent working in the fields under the blazing sun. He remembered the sting of being expelled, and the moment Hank's Rolls-Royce pulled up outside Westwood High, a turning point that changed everything. As he looked out at the sea of faces before him, Marcus felt a surge of emotion. "When I was growing up," he began, his voice steady and warm, "I dreamed of leaving my hometown behind. I wanted to escape the struggles of farm life and prove to myself and to the world that I could succeed despite the odds stacked against me." He paused, letting his words sink in. But what I didn't realize then was that those struggles were shaping me into the person I am today. He went on to share stories from his journey, the challenges he faced, the lessons he learned, and the people who supported him along the way. He spoke about Elijah, his hard-working father, whose quiet strength taught him the value of perseverance. He talked about Hank, the grandfather he barely knew until their lives intertwined over a shared fight for justice. And he thanked his teachers, friends, and even those who doubted him, saying, "Every challenge pushed me to grow stronger, every critic forced me to work harder, and every supporter reminded me why I couldn't give up." Marcus also reflected on how far he'd come since that day Mr. Grayson expelled him. Back then, he never imagined he'd earn a full scholarship to one of the country's top universities or graduate as valedictorian, not once, but twice. Yet here he was, standing before a crowd that hung on his every word, proving that dreams really could come true if you refused to let go of them. After the ceremony, Marcus walked across the campus, taking in the sprawling lawns, towering libraries, and bustling student center. It was a stark contrast to the dirt roads and cornfields of his childhood, but he carried a piece of home with him wherever he went. In his backpack was a journal filled with ideas for his future, a plan to return to his roots by starting programs that would help children like him gain access to education and opportunities. He envisioned building community centers in rural areas, offering tutoring, mentorship, and resources to kids who might otherwise be overlooked. Later that evening, Marcus sat down with Hank, Elijah, and the rest of his family for a celebratory dinner. They laughed, reminisced, and made plans for the future. Hank leaned back in his chair, watching Marcus with pride. "You've done more than make us proud," he said. "You've shown the world what's possible when you refuse to let anyone dim your light." Elijah nodded, tears glistening in his eyes. "You've always been destined for greatness, son. We just needed to get out of your way." As the night drew to a close, Marcus stepped outside and looked up at the stars. He thought about the boy he used to be, the one who walked miles to school, worked tirelessly on the farm, and dreamed of something bigger. That boy had grown into a man who understood the power of resilience, the importance of standing up for what's right, and the unbreakable bond of family. No matter where life took him next, Marcus knew one thing for certain. His journey wasn't just about achieving success. It was about lifting others as he climbed. And with that realization, he smiled, ready to take on whatever came next.